My name is Gabriel Šípoš. I work for Traffic, which is hosting this session on how to engage the finance industry in fighting cross-border corruption. And I'm going to present the panelists very soon, but just an introduction, I know we are a conservation NGO, and majority of people here actually engage directly in anti-corruption. So let me give you a bit of introduction what we do and why we're talking about anti-corruption here at this conference. You might have heard this afternoon Peter Eigen at the plenary. He talked about why it's so important to engage both public institutions and private sector together with civil society, and how that model seems to work for a lot of work on anti-corruption. And today we'll be talking about one specific private sector partner, and that's the financial institutions. We'll be talking about it from the perspective of cooperation with the public institutions, but also how can NGOs, how can civil society engage with them. And the specific angle that we'll be taking is the wildlife crime. How does that work out in the wildlife crime, and what are lessons perhaps for anti-corruption community as well. So if I can ask for the first set of slides, just to give you the explanation why is Traffic at this anti-corruption conference today. Okay, so trying to get the other slide. Thank you for the water. Okay, so this is the global map of illegal wildlife tribe of several species, and as you can see, it's a huge web of lines going pretty much to every country depending on the species. This illegal trade. We're talking about the estimates talk about 27 billion US dollars every year, and of course illegal trade also means that there's money flowing, sometimes in opposite direction as the goods, sometimes they're going to other countries. So anti-money laundering is a huge part of how we think about fighting corruption and fighting illegal wildlife trade. Also, you might have noticed that a lot of the flows are actually going from the countries that have relatively big rule of law challenges, the countries that are not that great in law enforcement, and that's exactly the very typical tool how you fight both corruption and also illegal wildlife trade. So as you can imagine, it presents a double challenge. You're trying to improve anti-corruption in those countries. At the same time, you sort of rely on the law enforcement to actually enforce all those laws that are mostly in place there. The usual problem stems from lack of the enforcement or lack of capacity to enforce those laws. And finally, I'll just show to give you the taste. What we're talking about. Why is it that we talk about corruption so much? Actually, most of the studies say that corruption is a key enabler of illegal wildlife trade, and that's the reason why Traffic actually got engaged into in this topic. Traffic is over 50 years old, but it's just this year that my position, anti-corruption coordinator, has been established, and I think most of the people at Traffic feel that unless you tackle corruption, you're not going to make huge progress anymore. Most of the laws, most of the policies are in place, they're just not being followed, they're implemented, and that's the key challenge. And the chart here behind me basically shows the supply chain, typical supply chain, and at each stage you can find a corruption problem. So yeah, it could be illegal harvesting, or even just changing the land zones. Of course, there can be corruption. Somebody can get to the land illegally. Furthermore, you have hunting licenses, or you have wildlife rangers who are supposed to guard the say reserves. Again, corrupt actors can get those people who are supposed to guard rules to either help them actually go after animals, or just not be present when the criminals are there. Then the goods are usually moving, either processed, or they're moving often through the borders. So you have customs officials as targets of corruption. You have transport companies, that are also targeted, and that's also in the source country and the final consumer country, of course. And finally, you get to the stage where you're trying to sell those either live animals or parts of the animals, and again, so you using usually legal means, legal companies that are also involved in illegal trade, and that's even more difficult. I didn't stress this, but of course there's also legal wildlife trade, and that sometimes actually makes it more difficult to differentiate legal from illegal trade. So roughly that's the supply chain, and as I said, at each stage you can find different actors and different corruption risks, and that's what we're trying to engage, trying to understand a bit more. That's the reason why we're coming to conferences like this and try to seek out anti-corruption organizations and partners who could help us actually fight the corruption, and to teach us the tools that we can use in the fight against the illegal wildlife trade. Nope. Yeah. If you want to get in touch, of course, there's much more information about traffic, but we'd be very happy if you could get in touch with us. And we wouldn't be here if the USAID didn't support not only our presence here, but also several years-long work with our partners, WWF, U4, Basel Institute, on governance, within the project called Tackling National Resource Corruption, where we try to, again, understand the role, to share that information with the other conservation organizations, and try to seek out partners. And on that, I'll talk specifically at the end of this panel. But you might be having this leaflet in your hands. This is something that we'll try to discuss at some length at the end of the panel. Okay, so that's the introduction, and that's basically the reason why we engage in anti-corruption, why this is so important not only for traffic but for other conservation organizations. And before I introduce the panelists on my left in person, we also have a very special guest online, Rowena Watson. She was not able to be with us, but fortunately she'll be able to talk to us through a Zoom call. I'm hoping that's going to work. Yeah, I can see her in the back. Let me introduce her though. Rowena Watson is, sorry, the technology is not terribly helpful, is a division chief in the Bureau of Oceans and International Scientific and Environmental Affairs at the U.S. State Department, leading the Combating Wildlife Trafficking and Wildlife Conservation team at the Office of Conservation and Water. She has extensive experience working on environmental security and nature crimes issues, including leading role on delegations to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and the UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. Rovina, thank you so much for coming to our panel.
Great.
Yeah, please share your thoughts with us.
Super. Okay, I'm assuming that you guys can hear me okay, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'm really glad that we're able to join our partners with Traffic and many of you in the private sector. I think that the U.S. has been working for quite a while on combating wildlife trafficking. We've seen this as a national security priority for a number of years. And now working on this frontier of really looking at the corruption is really exciting. So I'm thanking you guys all for being there. And especially, we're very glad to be partnering with Traffic, because the public-private partnerships with the NGO community, with the financial sector, and with the business sectors, this is really where we see how the action for tackling corruption and tackling money laundering and the proceeds of crime is really going to happen. That it takes this whole multi-stakeholder approach. It takes the whole suite of expertise and mandates and resources for that. So thank you very much to Traffic and to our organizers for letting us partner and join with you. And so a couple other things that I just wanted to mention about U.S. efforts on tackling financial crime associated with wildlife trafficking. We have been seeing this, like I said, as an issue for a number of years, and we've been talking about it from a larger policy perspective in diplomacy. We also bring our whole of government approach. We have a task force on combating wildlife trafficking that includes Department of Treasury, of course, is a key partner in this arena, as well as a number of law enforcement agencies and USAID and Department of Justice and many of our investigative agents. We've been keenly engaged on the Financial Action Task Force process and had a lot to do with the report and the recommendations that came out. And so I think we're working with a number of you on making sure that there is really good follow-up for that in the FATF efforts. And that was a massive step forward to get this recognized. We're very keen to make sure that the national risk assessments are including wildlife trafficking, and that some of those other key steps are going to be taken. Another thing I just wanted, two more things I wanted to mention. One, that the U.S. State Department recently instituted a visa and eligibility for wildlife and timber traffickers to, again, disrupt their operations and their networks and introduce another form of penalties. And frequently we use cases and information about their money laundering and their illicit financial flows in those cases for the visa eligibilities. And I also wanted to highlight that we've been looking increasingly at the convergence of wildlife trafficking with other forms of crime, not only with money laundering as a predicate offense and as a parallel offense in wildlife trafficking cases, but also wildlife trafficking combined with other forms of crime, whether that's something similar in nature crimes like illegal logging or illegal mining or IUU fishing and associated crimes, or if it's drug trafficking and human trafficking. But we're leveraging our intelligence community and all of our partners to look at that crime convergence element. So I again, sorry I can't be there in person, and we're really happy to be partnering with you and hearing more about this really important area about following the money and making sure that we get some of those proceeds back. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Rovina. Pleasure. I think many of the conservation partners also really appreciate the work of the U.S. government. It does come up oftentimes in in the wildlife cases. Actually, that's some of the best cases there are due to the U.S. government, the U.S. law enforcement actually working on the wildlife crime issues, and I'm pretty sure if the many other governments join this effort, we would be way further in the conservation as well. Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce the first of our panelists that are present in here, and we'll start on the far end of the table with Tolisile Kanile. She's a career prosecutor who has served different roles in law enforcement agencies for over 23 years. She served in a senior position in the Asset Forfeiture Unit in more than 5 years, and for 8 years she was appointed as a Director of Public Prosecutions. And currently, since January 2018, she has held the position of Director of the Financial Intelligence Center of South Africa, where she's been responsible for the strategic and operational functioning of the institution. She currently holds the position of also the chair of the Egmont Group, the international organization in charge of facilitating intelligence sharing between financial intelligence units around the world to investigate and prevent money laundering. We are thrilled to have you. Yeah, the key question, I think, of the panel is how does the partnership with the private sector, especially with the financial institution, how can this work for the mutual goal of saving wildlife, and at the same time, how does it help in tackling corruption?
Thank you, Gabriel. I'll start explaining what is a public-private partnership. I'm from a financial intelligence unit. And financial intelligence units, we receive a lot of information from the banks, your suspicious transaction reports. And when we receive that information, we analyze it, and we generate what we call an intelligence that we share with law enforcement agencies. Others will call it an STR regime, suspicious transaction report regime. When grand corruption happens, in most cases, we blame ourselves. And in South Africa, we found ourselves where people were blaming the banks and saying, where were the banks when corruption took place? Were they sleeping? Did they enable corruption? And we were also blamed as the financial intelligence unit to say, you are supposed to be seeing all this information and reporting it to law enforcement agencies. So we decided that instead of really us defending each other all the time, let's find a system that will improve the STR regime, the regime of the banks sending the reports to us, and us working on those reports, adding more information on them, being able to tell a story about the suspicious or illegal transactions or activities happening in a particular case that we're handling. So we said, in order to enhance this regime, instead of really replacing it with something else, let's form what we call a public-private partnership, where we're able to sit with the banks, we're able to sit with law enforcement agencies and FIU, and be able to have not a report coming from one bank, but to have a number of banks located in one place, and being able to have a targeted approach of looking at certain transactions. So we established, we called it a South African Anti-Money Laundering Integrated Task Force, and it was established in 2019, and our first project was the project of illicit wildlife trade. And we have seen a number of good things happening from that partnership. When we established this partnership, we said we'll invite our non-traditional AML CFT partners. We'll get NGOs, because NGOs are sitting with lots of information. We'll get money remitters. We had Western Union being part of the team. We had Luno. And we were able to really have our own risk assessment to say, what is our exposure when it comes to the issues of illicit wildlife trade? And we picked up that we were having serious problems. We picked up that we also have corruption enabling or facilitating the commission of illicit wildlife trade. And that corruption is happening in all the levels that you have touched on the supply chain, from poachers really being informed or getting leaked information about the activities of law enforcement agencies, from officials that are working in our game reserves, rangers who are supposed to be protecting these animals, but they are getting tempted and they are getting paid to leak information, from even your law enforcement agencies that are supposed to be investigating these cases. So corruption is there, and it becomes a serious impediment in this fight. But how do we win this fight when you've got corruption and you really want to protect your animals and make sure that these beautiful creatures are still available for your grandchildren? They are still able to go and visit the nature reserves, the game reserves, and see a rhino. We said, let's do what we call an intelligence-driven investigations. Let's use the banks when they are sitting together and having a targeted approach. Let's be able to say, we'll get a comprehensive report from all these banks and we'll involve an FIU, a financial intelligence unit, and ensure that we are able to give law enforcement agencies information that will assist them in really following the money and allowing that exercise of following the money to lead them to the kingpins and the people who are at the top of this syndicate. You can only disrupt organized crime by reaching the people who are at the top. If you just focus, if you just celebrate the arrest and you celebrate the recoveries and you celebrate the forfeiture of a house where the activities are being happening, it's easy to replace all those people. In our report, if you see it, you'll see that people are getting paid 1,000 rands. In US dollars, it's about less than 60. So for people to give information to say, these are the activities, this is a place where the population is growing of the rhinos, this is the right time for you to come and expect and evade detection. It's only 1,000 rands. So it's not a lot of money, but where is the lot of money going to? It goes to the kingpins. So you need to follow the money and change the approach of thinking this is just ordinary crime. This is an organized crime and it needs to be treated as such. We've seen when we looked at the cases, because we work with law enforcement agencies, we've tried to track and see what kind of cases we've been dealing with and what has been the success rate. I will tell you that law enforcement agencies will say there's a good story to tell. In 2019, we had about 332 arrests relating to illicit wildlife trade in South Africa with a conviction rate of 98%. So when you tell the country that story, that there's a conviction rate of 98%, people are thinking you're doing a good job. But we had to say to law enforcement agencies, it's a good job, but there's something big that you are missing. There's something big that won't enable you to disrupt this organized crime. Start bringing these cases to us so that we can follow the money, and the money will lead us to the people at the top. And we also checked whether we've had any corruption cases in the past when dealing with this with this space. And we picked up that we didn't have them. But with this collaboration, we're starting to pick up even corruption cases, having people arrested. We've got a case that is in court recently where 2 rangers, I must say it's not general that the rangers are always corrupt. There are rangers who are putting their lives at risk and they are dying whilst protecting these animals. But we have had a case involving 8 accused, but 2 of those accused were rangers in Kruger National Park, which is our biggest nature reserve. And those rangers were giving information for the past 6 years before the arrest to the poachers to say this is the right place, the population is growing. And before they were arrested, at the vicinity where these rhinos where there were invasions, where they were in incursions, we are having about 10 to 15 invasions in a month. After their arrest, we only had 4 for the past 152 days. So we have disrupted really by just dealing with 2 people. And how were they arrested? It's financial information, it's financial intelligence, because we now have an integrated approach and we've got a financial intelligence unit getting involved in these cases. And the financial intelligence information told us that these people for the past 6 months, both of them received about $500,000 into their bank accounts. Some of the payments were going to girlfriends and to relatives. So it's very important that we treat this as a profitable offense and as organized crime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tollisile. I'll ask one more question though, before we hand over to your colleagues. I'd like to ask specifically about the overall corruption challenges, not just related to wildlife crime. As I showed the map, many countries that are very much biodiversity rich countries also face a lot of corruption. And I'd like to ask, how is it? How do you think it changes the situation if you're trying to go after the corrupt actors within a country where there are a lot of other corruption risks and challenges? What does that change the picture? Does the illegal wildlife trade or wildlife crimes do they come as a priority in such a situation? And does it make your job in a way much more difficult? And you're also chairing the Eggman group, so you're in touch with a lot of your colleagues from all over the world. So how do you think does that job changes in such a situation?
Let me tell you, I think what assisted us a lot was the FATF project and the FATF paper on this issue, because it was an eye-opener and it was sending a message to all of us to say, go back to your countries and start really understanding your exposure. And we said, this is what we need to do. Why did we prioritize it as South Africa? We are known, really, we don't run short of problems and crime in my country. But we love the animals. We pride ourselves by saying, you'll find the big 5 when you visit us. We've got about 42 of these game reserves in our country. It's an issue of economy, it's an issue of tourism. When people leave their countries visiting South Africa, this is what they want to see. And it's also an issue of reputation, and an issue of saying, what messages are we going to be sending to our kids? Are we going to say, go to the zoo and only see monkeys? So it wasn't really difficult to try and persuade everyone and say, we are doing a good job, but let's have that paradigm shift now and prioritize this and accept that it is financial crime, it is money laundering. And the message that we are sending to police officers is that even prefer charges of money laundering, and we are seeing those charges being preferred, and we are seeing people getting convicted. So it was easy, really, for us to do that. We also had good partners in our projects. We working with United for Wildlife, and the banks were very, very much excited about this project. I must say it's the love of our beautiful creatures, and we pride ourselves by saying, come to our country and you'll see the big five. And we don't want to say there's no big five, there's a big three now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd love to know more about the cooperation with the banks, actually, with the financial institutions, but it's great to hear that you find that cooperation working. And we do have a representative of the finance industry with us, right on my left, Stephen Dennison. He is from the US, from HSBC, one of the largest banks in the world. He manages, let me introduce him a bit more in detail. He manages the sanctions, geopolitics, and trade portfolios on the US financial crime analysis team as part of the HSBC's compliance function. He's a certified anti-money laundering specialist, and at HSBC he conducts proactive intelligence analysis on emerging and evolving financial crime threats, fusing banks and commercially available data with open source research. Recently, his analytical work has centered on environmental crime. Before joining HSBC, Stephen worked for 10 years on various intelligence roles at the UK Ministry of Defence. While there, he focused on counter-terrorism investigations and the disruptions of terrorist networks. Great to have you, Stephen. And the question for you is how, being on the other side of this partnership, how do you how does the bank, make the illegal wildlife trade a priority? And what are you seeing? You're doing a lot of intelligence work. So what are you seeing in the data? And if you could perhaps describe a little bit for us, how does it work? What kind of data you need? What kind of data you use? And what follows if you find something? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction, Gabriel, and Rowena as well. Firstly, I'll just say it's a great honor to be invited on this panel alongside such distinguished presenters, or at least Sylvain and Ben. I'm truly an admirer of your collective work across Traffic and Samlet and the Egmont Group more broadly, and I can see. We have much to learn coming from the perspective of the financial sector. I hope to give you a sense of what we're doing, where we are trying to improve, to learn and to partner in answer to your questions, Gabriel. But I will say, in the South African case in particular, in preparation for this session, I've been conferring with colleagues in HSBC South Africa, and I know they speak very highly of your work. And back to the point of energy, I think there's a lot of excitement, and we can see that in the South African case, we're really it's really pioneering work, which I hope we will be able to take lessons from and extrapolate out to other jurisdictions. Because, as Gabriel said, HSBC is clearly a very large bank with a global presence, a global trade bank. We operate, we have a network of, we operate in 63 countries and territories around the world. We have, I've got the numbers here, at last count, approximately 40 million customers, as individuals and corporates. And it will be no surprise when we were looking at the maps of trade routes that touch on the wildlife trade. I look at that map and I see overlaps with our trade routes that we do business through and we facilitate business through. Increasingly front of mind, we are thinking about environmental crime and the illegal wildlife trade, and what may be underpinning some of that activity. I did want to ask, is there anyone else in the room from a financial institution or the financial sector? Apart from my colleague, Nicole. Oh, we have two. Okay, that's great. Okay. Correct me if I get anything wrong here. But I'm speaking from the perspective of HSBC, and specifically HSBC in the US, where I work. As we get into the discussion, different financial institutions will approach things differently. They will structure things differently. They will face different challenges. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from previous sessions is one of the key elements here is that we make sure that we are taking a risk-based approach, mindful of our footprints and our customers and the products that we offer to make sure that we're doing the best we can to pinpoint illicit activity. I'm going to just, I'll spare you too many stats, but I will say just to frame the issue a little more broadly, for HSBC globally, every month we are screening over 1.1 billion transactions, and we're looking for signs of money laundering and financial crime. And I'll get into some of the mechanics of what a bank does to counter illicit activity, including corruption and wildlife crime. But emanating from those reviews, last year we filed a little over 5,600 suspicious activity reports across the various jurisdictions that we operate in. So big numbers all round. And I say that not to... I'm not kind of trying to diminish the issue, but and we know from the introductions that the sums of money involved and obviously the environmental degradation are colossal. But saying that, against the backdrop of global trade, sadly we do find that we are in many ways tackling this as a little bit of a needle in a haystack issue. It can be very challenging for us, particularly from our perspective in the US, to hone in on illicit activity with the available information that we have, which is why I think it's so important that we harness partnerships, we work with government, with NGOs to do everything that we can to make ourselves more effective. So very briefly, I just wanted to give you a sense of how our bank is configured to mitigate risk. And I think that there'll be strong overlaps, I hope, with other peer banks and major financial institutions. But I'll lead off with where I'm coming from. So Gabriel outlined the team that I am part of. So we're quite an interesting function within the bank. We provide proactive monitoring of emerging risks. And our goal is to make sure that stakeholders within the bank know what is on the horizon, where there are gaps. And so we have a real focus on areas where perhaps our bank controls have not traditionally been configured to address these sorts of issues. And the wildlife crime, environmental crime is, I think, one of those growth areas. And over the last couple of years on our team, we've certainly done a lot of work to try and raise awareness, take topics like illegal fishing, illegal logging, the illegal wildlife trade, and other issues, and try and think about how they manifest for our bank, because that's what's key. What do we see in our data, and once we identify, if we identify illicit nexuses, illicit networks, we can then take lessons learned from that work and build it out and develop typologies and indicators specific to the bank. And then use that, particularly when we look for the issue in other jurisdictions, across other trade corridors, to see whether there are overlaps and commonalities. It's a challenging issue. I'm going to sketch very quickly some of the controls that we have in place in the bank, because I think it's important to keep in mind those structures, because I think it's I hope it's informative for NGOs and others when you're thinking about how you might best interface with us. So we have control frameworks that are pretty sophisticated, it's fair to say. We've built up, in the US in particular, an FIU-type structure, staffed by a range of experts in money laundering and investigations and whatnot. And we have various steps in place to try and stop bad actors from entering our system, or if our system and products are being exploited to mitigate risks. So one of those is customer due diligence. So we work very hard to make sure that we understand for all of our customers what their expected activity is, what their expected account usage is, what their source of wealth is, source of funds, what jurisdictions we expect them to be operating in, and that helps give us a baseline so that if there are anomalies and shifts, if, for example, they start dealing with industries that don't really match up, that could be a trigger for further investigation. And that's risk-based. So if we're looking at certain jurisdictions, certain industries that touch on environmental crime issues or potentially touch on those issues, we will then roll out enhanced due diligence and do a deeper dive and a more regular review of those sorts of customers. One important element I want to call out is our negative news screening work. So regularly we have cycles where we will, using various external providers, pull news articles, government statements, anything out there in the public domain that can be obtained readily, and we will look for overlaps with customers across the jurisdictions that we operate in. So if, for example, a report is published on a specific wildlife crime network and it names 10 companies involved, if those companies happen to be customers or individuals referenced happen to be customers, that should trigger further review. As a sort of another element of that, we have screening processes, and they're really important in the sanctions space. And we've heard from particularly in the U.S. government side how greater use is being used of GLOMAC sanctions and other controls and responses to wildlife trafficking networks in particular. And I think that's very exciting because that's kind of the gold standard for us. If we have it's very black and white. If an individual or a company is sanctioned, that cascades down to other entities they have control over, and we have robust controls to to identify, mitigate, and prevent transactions that touch on those entities. We have a dedicated investigation team in every country that we operate in, and they're kind of real experts, and they can drill down into the detail of internally filed reports or information that comes from external sources, and they can do everything from reaching out to the customer, collating information, and mitigate risks that way. We have, almost at the end of the list, but we have anti-money laundering transaction monitoring controls. And these, I'm sure everyone in the room has had an alert. You've done something unusual. Was this you? That's one element of this, but we have models and processes running constantly to pick up on anomalous, unusual shifts, perhaps structuring of transactions in an attempt to circumvent reporting requirements. And those tools are being tweaked and configured and can trip. Any bad actor involved in any type of financial crime will hopefully, at one point or another, trip that. We've talked about public-private partnerships, and HSBC participates wherever we can in these fora. It's an exciting space, and in the US, there are great mechanisms in place through the USA Patriot Act, through Section 314A to help with partnerships between government and private sector. And I think an important, exciting element here is Section 314B of the Patriot Act, which enables financial institutions to share information in furtherance of countering money laundering and terrorism type offences, and that provides us with safe harbour to share information that would otherwise be protected and restricted. And this is all that's all very important because. Even with the size of HSBC, we can potentially be a part of the puzzle, but bad actors, don't gravitate to, well, they don't rely solely on single institutions. They will pan multiple institutions and jurisdictions, and so anything that we can do to break down those silos and piece together the different fragments, the different parties around the table and different financial institutions have is very helpful. We're trying to build networks to counter these networks. We feel that's the best way to tackle that issue. I think just to close, I will say that again, going back to my perspective from the US. We do find with the wildlife trade in particular, or the illegal wildlife trade, it's a challenging problem set. For the most part, we are, unlike other categories of financial crime, we're not, for the most part, not looking at customers in the US for the most part. We're very reliant on reviewing transactions data, so cross-border wire data, and we have a ton of data, as I touched on with the numbers, voluminous data that we can mine and query and manipulate and try and do everything we can to surface activity that might warrant further review. But there are limitations with transactions data. So we'll see the transacting parties, their addresses, hopefully payment details associated with the wires, and we can use that for keyword searching. But when in the case of open account trade, it can be very difficult for us to get to the underlying trade documents. And then even though, as we know in these cases, there's heavy use of falsified, misrepresented documents, the corrupt officials that make this challenging. So that's not to say that there's nothing that can be done, but I think that leads us to being very reliant on lead data. That can, I think, from our most successful internal projects, that's the best springboard, whether it's a list of names or a typology, a new typology. That can be the springboard. We can take that, we'll map it out, see what exposure we may have, and then look to see across those other jurisdictions whether it manifests elsewhere. And we'll always look to mitigate the risk, and that can take a number of forms. It can be exiting relationships, it can be blocking transactions, engagement with customers. Some may be complicit, some non-complicit, to help them shut down avenues for exploitation by bad actors. So I'll leave it there for now. Hopefully that gives you a bit of context for where banks fit into the equation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Yeah, it was great to get a bit of a preview the way you work with the data. I also have one question for you. One difficult question for you is you've been here for a second day, and you've probably been to a couple of sessions, and the names of the banks or financial institutions come up in many of the corruption cases. A lot of civil society players do mention them a lot. And for good reason, even in illegal wildlife trade cases, if you have a look, and at many of them, so at some point there is a money laundering that just, was successful, and wasn't stopped. So I'd like to ask, what's the key learning, from these cases in the past? What was the key point where the finance industry failed? Was it's just so much data that it's hard to see things, or was it just a bad individual decision, the way risk was evaluated, or was it just that the profit motive was too high, and just a couple of people decided that this is worth the risk? What's the key learning, and how what gives us hope that the finance industry will be better actually at dealing with these risks than before?
That's a great question, and you're right, not an easy question, but I'll do my best to do it justice. I don't want to sugarcoat it. Obviously, HSBC is, along with many other banks, has had major issues in the past in the money laundering space and elsewhere, that's clearly problematic. I hope that I've given you a sense of how our controls continue to evolve and to respond and to learn. It's not as simple. I think it's fair to say it's not as simple as sort of profit margins and such like, because as we've seen with past cases. Where banks are found to be deficient, the fallout for banks financially, reputationally, can be colossal, and so there's no appetite for that kind of fallout or tolerance. I think we're learning, and there are aspects of financial crime where we perhaps have a stronger, more robust understanding of how our products are being used and our networks are being used, but I don't think there's any easy answer. I hope we're moving in the right direction. And I think, we'll get on to talk a little bit about cooperation. And I think I see, I've been with the bank for 4 years, and even in that time, I see progress. I see that we're on a journey, and I see us opening up avenues for cooperation and learning, and hopefully that trajectory will continue, and the future will be brighter, because I'm surrounded by professionals who very skilled, very talented individuals who are hell bent on doing all they can to counter financial crime of every flavour. So yeah, hopefully that's a little bit of.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
And last but not least, let me present to you my colleague, actually, Ben Brock, working at Traffic as well. He works on wildlife crime as an analyst. He has 15 years of experience working with the UK government, disrupting transnational organized crime, predominantly in drug, weapon, and people trafficking. At the UK government, he fulfilled a range of investigation and intelligence roles, with a particular focus on financial and communications intelligence to map and identify key targets within serious and organized criminal networks. At Traffic, Ben has specialized in countering wildlife and environmental crime. Recently, he has produced several publications, including an e-course exploring how engaging the finance industry can offer mutual benefits to both sectors, and that's exactly the key question of this panel. So, could you Ben tell us a little bit about your work and maybe about the pluses and minuses, about the benefits and challenges in working with the finance industry?
Thank you very much. May I have the remote control, please? I may actually really not use the slides. You may all be very pleased to know. First of all, just the thank yous. Thank you to USAID for supporting our work and for enabling us to be here. Thank you to Rowena at the State Department. And also thank you to all of you. This is like, you may well have been here for 10 hours today. So I respect for keeping going. Well done. Before I actually speak about the presentation, listening to my fantastic co-panelists actually triggers several thoughts. The first of which may be a sentence which has never been said at IACC before, which is corruption and money laundering. What a fantastic opportunity. And I say this because, I work in a conservation sector. We're looking to conserve the world. Quick definition. We'll talk about IWT, the illegal wildlife trade. Within Traffic, that's both elephants and rhinos, but that's also fish and timber. So we do the whole, pretty much if it's alive, we care about it. And the criminal groups that involve themselves in these things we see corruption almost all the time when we look at the international supply chains. And if it's an acquisitive crime, you almost can't help but launder the money. If you make money off a crime, you're going to commit a money laundering offence, which means that we have this great opportunity to not work alone. Traffic is 200 people about, spread across 50 countries, so our capacity is tiny. But because these people are engaged in money laundering and corruption, we have this enormous remit to engage with, like, the corruption environment yourselves. Sorry, law enforcement habit. I don't always put the anti in front of the crime type I'm speaking about. So yeah, we'll work with that. And then particularly to be able to work with the banks and the FIUs. And there's two very concrete examples I'd like to give of why that's incredibly helpful. So Traffic, we do training to a variety of different financial institutions to help them understand the money laundering risk. And the first time I did this, I was like, yeah, I'm very happy to do this. And it was during COVID, so it was all remote. And I was expecting to speak to a room full of people, about this many. And in my naivety, I didn't actually ask. I just said, okay, we're going to do this. Fantastic. Off we go. And they said, yeah, you're going to speak to the transaction monitoring team. Okay, brilliant. And so I'm thinking, yeah, 20 people? 600 people were on the call. And it's two things. One, it shows how interested banks really are in this. That's 600 hours of people's time being taken up. So they care enough to actually dedicate staff time and money to respond to this. And the other one is the importance of, once you get into the world of anti-money laundering, it's a universal language. It doesn't matter which country you're in. Thanks to the works of FATF and FIUs, they have to respond in certain ways. If you walk into a bank, well, maybe don't walk into the bank, but if you contact the bank's compliance department or anti-money laundering department, and you say, I have credible and reliable information that one of your customers is laundering significant money through your institution, you will have their attention. They will say, okay, tell me more. If I walk up to them and say, the Siberian tigers could be extinct within 20 years, I'm not going to get that. And that's why reframing some of these threats is very, very useful. And also, thinking back to, I don't know how many of you went to the plenary after lunch, where it was that terrifying talk about the attacks on activists, and also the nuisance lawsuits that will get thrown against NGOs that tie them up. There's another wonderful thing about money laundering, is it has protected information sharing gateways. And so by working with FIUs, you have, disclaimer, check the legislation of the country you're talking to. It does differ from place to place, but, sorry? Okay. But like FinCEN, for example.
It's so accurate.
Okay, good. But FinCEN, for example, in the US, have fantastically robust information sharing gateways. And this means, and Traffic has done this through the South African FIU into SAMLET, we want information to reach the banks. But if we share that information directly to the banks and someone found out about it, Traffic could be exposed to nuisance lawsuits. By going through these channels, you can't. They are protected. And if you're reporting a money laundering offence, so it's no good, again, I'm not telling them that, well, I'm not talking to them about rhino trafficking, I'm talking to them about money laundering, and that enables these protections. So, so that's why these things are actually a great opportunity. I'm going to skip onto the presentation. Next slide, please. We'll move through this at pace. I thought it was going to be important to talk about the scale of the crimes, the money involved in it, but actually that's something I've heard a lot of people speak about this week. The one I'm going to be talking about, illegal timber. USAID estimate the illegal timber trade to be worth between about 50 to 150 billion per year. This is not small scale. There's a phrase in the UK people call people who work in conservation tree huggers. This is not tree hugger money. This is serious, serious money. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, it's not just financial. We're talking about harm. When people are clear-cutting entire forests, we're not only losing the capacity of that forest to absorb carbon, that's often releasing further damage into the world. And we're talking about, so this is the World Health Organization, this isn't Ben Brock. The World Health Organization is saying we're looking at 250,000 additional deaths per year between 2030 and 2050. Next slide, please. I'm a great believer in giving credit where it's due. So the next points I'm going to be talking about were actually done by EIA, the Environmental Investigation Agency. They're fantastic. I just wanted to call them out. And on the other side is our financial flows and payment mechanisms. It looks at the money laundering that has been seen, actual case studies of money laundering in the illegal wildlife trade. Next slide, please. So, Siberian tigers, this is what we were talking about. The RFE, Russian Far East, area roughly two-thirds the size of America, and still has a lot of original large-scale forest, and it's the home of Siberian tigers. A lot of this timber is exported to China. 96% of it goes over to China. Between 50 and 80% of it is harvested illegally, and the oak exports in 2010 doubled the amount of harvest permits. This is by no means unusual. A whole variety of countries you can go to and you can look at how much could legally be harvested and how much was exported, and they're an order of magnitude higher. And to me, that is a great place to start asking questions. Next slide, please. This timber then goes from China. It's manufactured into different things, flooring, furniture, and exported by percentage to around the world. You'll be familiar with that. Again, you can see it's a lot of money. No, that's all right, fine, move along, thank you. Good anticipation. A particular case, I'm a huge fan of the US has some great legislation, the Patriot Act and the Lacey Act. Lumber liquidators, I believe, were or are one of the largest timber companies in the US. In 2016, they were fined $13.15 million for importing timber that had been illegally harvested. And I know sometimes when we talk about tainted supply chains or things, people are like, well, it's red tape. We're just cutting away the red tape. We're making it more efficient. We're making it more effective. We're making it more profitable. Well, in 2019, they got fined $33 million for having far too much formaldehyde in the timber that was being put into people's homes in America. You may have seen it on 60 Minutes. And it just shows that a tainted and illegitimate supply chain is not going to do hardly anyone any good. And so there's a lot of different opportunities to work with retailers, to work with the banks who are facilitating and facilitating sounds bad in that thing, who are clearing payments for these people, but they have a vested interest in stopping illegality. And also investors. Investing organisations don't want to be carrying risk of illegality in their portfolio by helping to express these risks. Next slide, please. So corruption. Where does corruption sit in this? Well, I started to list where corruption occurred in the between the Russia and China part. It's amazing. There's almost every single part of it can be corrupted. From Russian logging brigades paying between $3 and $6 per cubic meter to get local officials to stamp the wood as being legitimate, through to, this is from EIA's reports where they've had undercover reporters speaking to timber exporters and timber producers. We've got people, Chinese importers into China, employing in Russia the son of the deputy governor of the region as the export director, the brother of the attorney general as their local salesperson, and another one was proudly told the EIA investigators that they financed the New Year's Eve celebrations for Chinese New Year at the consulate. So we're seeing all different types and levels of corruption. But going back a little bit, you'll remember that the export volumes doubled the harvest allocations. That's not disguised. That's an opportunity to look at that and take that down the supply chain and say, okay, if you're receiving timber from these locations, how are you justifying that this is not illegal timber? And under the Lacey Act and under the EU timber regulations, they now both put a due diligence responsibility onto the companies. The EU timber regulations say specifically, if the risk is above negligible, risk assessment and mitigation has to take place along the supply chain. And I think that's a great opportunity to ask these companies, are you doing it? How are you doing it? Talk me through it. Find out who they bank with. That's not that hard. It's, transparency information is fantastic. Who's banking with them? Ask their bank. Do you know how they're ensuring that they've got a clean supply chain? Work with our partners, and this is a great opportunity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to call out the Targeting Natural Resource Corruption Library as the fantastic resource. We don't expect everyone to know about natural resource corruption. It's a fantastic place to go to in order to get more information. Rachel, if I can put you on the spot, I know tomorrow there is a practice part. I'll let you explain what it is tomorrow.
Sure. So, thank you. Always nice to have a plug put in. We have a practitioners forum meeting tomorrow. We're going to be, I believe, in the Empire Room. Embassy Room, thank you, at 12:30. And essentially, this is a forum that was launched just on the first day of the Congress. It is an attempt to bridges between anti-corruption and conservation community members to strengthen programming that's more resilient.
Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you very much. Gabe was telling me I've got another 2 minutes, but I don't want to miss out on questions from the floor. And with such a small room, it actually gives an opportunity to actually have a bit of a discussion. So, at the risk of challenging, I'll let you moderate. But
Thank you, Ben. No, you mentioned 10 hours. It's getting to 11th hour now for many of the people. So yeah, I'd really love to hear from the audience and from your experience. Or either you try to work with the finance industry, perhaps that's one of the reasons that you came to this session, or perhaps you'd like to hear more from the panelists. But I think this is a good time to open this up to questions and comments. I'll hand over the mic to you. Anybody? Yeah.
Hi, hello, Sophie. My name, I work for the German Development Corporation, GIZ, and we work together with reporting entities, the financial sector and the non-financial sector, on the FATF standards. And one actually of the feedbacks that we got from the banks is that there are not enough feedback loops on the SDRs. And for example, we have also been working with the Financial Intelligence Unit in Peru, and in the past years, the SDRs have just skyrocketed, and they don't have the capacity to analyze them. So also looking at the issue of quality and quantity of SDRs, what is something that, going in the next years that we can improve, and rather saying it's not just about the banks, all of them, just sending millions and millions of SDRs, but actually what is the quality of it? And do banks to know more also, let's say from law enforcement, what should they look at? I mean, you also mentioned that you have your own analysis, but would it be helpful to get more information? Do we need more forums? So yeah, I would be happy to hear more about it. Thank you.
That's for you, Stephen, I'm sure.
I think it is, yeah. Thank you, Steve. That's a great comment, and that really resonates with me, and particularly conversations I've had with investigators within the bank responsible for filing suspicious activity reports. We do everything that we can to make sure that our SARs are as high quality as possible, packed with relevant information, relevant identifiers, I know from experience that a lot of work goes into some of those SARs, and it's fair to say that there is oftentimes, a sense that that the SARs disappear into a bit of a black hole. That's not to say that we never get feedback, but feedback is very much appreciated, and I think a feedback loop is the best way to make sure that the quality of those documents is there's an upward trajectory, and you're right. We don't want to swamp FIUs and partners, and I know I did mention some numbers early on, but fewer high quality SARs is really the goal. So anything that can be done to help us get better and to provide us with context. Obviously, there are all kinds of issues with intelligence sharing and challenges. So there's a recognition that we can't find out everything, but any kind of flavor for which elements of SARs, which types of SARs are useful, and also separate from individual SARs. How are SARs useful in the aggregate? And I think, I can't remember whether we talked on this or in the previous panel, I think touched on FinCEN reporting on, breaking out SARs in the environmental crime space or wildlife trafficking space and highlighting themes that are useful. So we recognize not every SAR is going to be groundbreaking, but if it's a useful piece of the puzzle somewhere along the way, it's nice to find that out. So yeah.
Do we have any idea? You mentioned 5,600 SARs last year, I believe. Do we have any, number? How many times we get a feedback?
Feedback. I don't have any figures on feedback. I will say anecdotally, speaking to colleagues, our sense is that at least in the US, in the region of 10 to 15% of SARs are useful, or have a significant impact, which is obviously relatively low in terms of the man hours and effort that goes into that. And we would love to know if there are things that we are reporting on that are of no value, and that feedback loop would help us kind of target resources more effectively. Yes.
What is a SAR?
Oh, okay. Of course. Sorry, apologies. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry for throwing acronyms out there. So a SAR is a suspicious activity report, also known as a suspicious transaction report in other jurisdictions. I'm speaking from the US perspective. But yeah, it's just a document that a financial institution or another organization shares with government privately with information that might indicate financial, illicit activity of some sort.
Thank you, Stephen. I think this is a very good question also for Tolisile. Could you, I mean, this is a different country, but could you perhaps tell us, what kind of feedback you're sending back to banks? How do you go about actually encouraging them to file those reports? Thank you.
I think the question that has been asked is a very much valid issue, and we discuss it as FIUs to say how do we ensure that we really don't talk about numbers, break about numbers, or focus on the issue of compliance, but we get quality reports, because without quality reports you won't be able to produce a quality intelligence. And if you don't produce a quality intelligence, whatever you send to law enforcement agencies won't be actionable, it won't be utilized. And FATF expects that the STR regime must assist law enforcement agencies in investigating, securing convictions, and recovering assets. So one of the good examples of enhancing the STR regime that we have seen is those issues of forming the public-private partnership, where you are able to even share your priorities, to say, as an FIU, this is what I'm prioritizing. In these public-private partnerships, when you have projects, like the projects that I've been speaking about, that we did as the South African Anti-Money Laundering Task Force on illicit financial flows associated with illicit wildlife trade, we're able to really share with the banks the indicators, the alerts, to say this is what will tell you that what we are seeing relates to illicit wildlife trade. Because in most cases, banks will send information, but not knowing what is the offense. It's a suspicious transaction, but sometimes it's not clear that what is behind that suspicious transaction. Are we dealing with drugs? Are we dealing with arms or tax evasion? But it's good when you sit as a collective to be able to share those alerts and those indicators. With the project that we did on illicit wildlife trade, we could even see after sharing those alerts that the STRs that the banks were sending on illicit wildlife trade increased by 60%. So it's very critical that we focus on what then. You have sent the STR, what then? So feedback is very critical, but it's not only feedback that we give to the banks. I think as a result of the public-private partnership, I've seen that the banks have committed, the banks have capacity, they are more capacitated than the public sector. I always say this, that in my country I have a staff of about 200 people working in the Financial Intelligence Center, but half of them are dealing with compliance. So it's less than 100 if you remove HR. And one bank, your bank is very active in the Samlet, but there's one big bank that has about 2,000 analysts. So if you compare that, I'm talking about one, and in the Samlet who are sitting with 26 banks, so it doesn't make sense. So it's very important for governments, if our governments are committed in fighting money laundering, financial crimes. It's very important that our banks capacitate the FIUs so that they can be able to deal with all this information, because not all the STRs result into an intelligence that is shared with law enforcement agencies. But it gets even worse when the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit, has worked and done an analysis and interpretation and produced this intelligence that gives a story about unlawful activities to law enforcement agencies. And then law enforcement agencies do nothing about that case, because that's what we are also seeing. So that training, that paradigm shift of saying, if you are saying we are having a problem of corruption, of financial crimes, of money laundering, let's start now building skills. It's not an issue of just having thousands numbers, but it's the right skills to understand how to do financial investigation. Is to have your financial investigators, your analysts, your data capturers, your forensic accountants, all those skills that are relevant when it comes to understanding the financials. Thank you.
Thank you, Theresia, for highlighting the need for cooperation again. I saw a gentleman with the hand raised. If you please could pass him the mic.
Hello. Thank you. My name is Patrick Dykman from Codename Transparency. I have a tricky question. What happens, for example, you mentioned about the urgency in the message of trying to bring it to the present and not say, okay, 50 years from now, that something's going to happen to the tigers. I have an example in the fishing industry. What happens when local regulation enables loopholes, in this case for shark bycatch, that makes, in a way, viable for local fishermen to make landings of that bycatch and fin them. So in a way, from a local perspective, they're on the good side of the law, but we all know that it's not sustainable, especially from a CITES perspective, because these are endangered species, silky sharks, and all the sharks are already threatened. So you can look at them, okay, on the long term, this is obviously something that's not beneficial for the environment, and you have these, maybe both of you can handle this, you have this, like, I don't know who like, obviously the beneficiary is someone in China, and but the intermediaries are the fishing, not the fishing, the transportation fleets that are financed by the finance sector. So how do you handle that? It's very like in a gray area.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and it does bring one of the points which is critical, which is a limiting factor with this approach. There has to be a crime. If I won't get in. If you're really bored one evening, you can look into the legislation around predicate offences. I won't bore the audience with it now, but it's essential to know that basically, if a crime has been committed and it's for profit, the proceeds will almost inevitably handling them will cause a money laundering offence to have occurred, and then financial institutions have a legal responsibility to respond. But if a crime hasn't occurred, no matter how damaging, no matter how unethical, there's not going to be a money laundering offence to respond to, and then the banks, it becomes something that they'll do under their social responsibility, possibly.
So you would have to, for example, to prove that it's targeted and it's not bycatch, so in order to become a crime, so that
I'm not good enough with fishing legislation to know where the crime occurs, but. Yes. Yeah. So as the lawyer says, there does have to be a crime, and then you'll get into money laundering. But if there isn't a crime, you probably not. It's not money laundering.
But I will say that there's a very good point, and the crime element is key. But for a bank, I don't want to understate the importance of the ESG agenda and reputational risk. So even if something is not a crime, it may fall outside our bank's risk appetite. And there are many categories of activity that fall into that space. Obviously, you're not going to get into the territory of prosecutions and fines and stuff, but you might small victories, but that could result potentially in the withdrawal or restriction of banking services to entities involved in unsavory activity that doesn't clearly cross over into criminal activity. So that's part of the spectrum.
Thank you so much. I see two more hands. Yeah, the lady in red, please.
Sure, I have a question for Stephen as well. Actually two, but the first is just to make sure the second isn't ridiculous.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, sorry. My name's Nicole Bird. I work for a counter-human trafficking organization called The Network. My understanding is that you don't actually have to be a financial professional to write a SAR, to file one. Is that correct?
Oh, gosh. It's putting me on the spot there. I'm not sure of the detail of the reporting requirements beyond financial institutions. I believe, yeah, there are non-financial institutions that would also be able to file reports. Yeah.
Okay, so for those of us who work in organizations, and there are so many of us at this conference, where we get information about people and properties and things like that within organized criminal groups, even if we don't have access to banking information per se, do you just have any thoughts on to what extent it would be helpful to document some of that and try to get it into the flow of SARs?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and I can totally see where you're coming from, and that's that it would be great for that flow to happen. I think it's all about. One way of doing that is to engage with financial institutions. It will be very challenging. You may not know, which financial institutions are involved. But in terms of the types of activity, the jurisdictions, that might give you some pointers. I can't speak for the entirety of the financial sector, but I will say that HSBC is very open to engaging and partnering, as we have done with traffic. I think very successfully, I hope, and I look forward to that relationship growing. So that's one way, if you're able to engage with institutions, find the right people, and feed information in that way. But also in a more passive way, not to underplay this, but publishing reports, getting press coverage out there is, going back to my point about negative news monitoring stuff, that can still trigger mechanisms within banks. And it might be a long shot sometimes, but that can, if there's a customer involved and indication of illicit illegal activity, there can be a flow in ideal circumstances that could result in the SAR. But going back to the feedback points, you would never find out from outside perspective. But yeah, it's a couple of ways you could hopefully achieve those at the end.
Tolisila, please.
In terms of the global standards, it's certain institutions or businesses that can file STRs with the financial intelligence units. It's not only the banks. Sometimes it will be your attorneys, it will be your accountants, it will be your estate agents, your casinos, people who are dealing with high-value goods. It depends on the legislation of each country. But what we have done, because I call NGOs your non-traditional AML CFT partners, but they sit with a wealth of information. What we have done in our project, because we are allowed to get information from any whistleblower, we've treated the NGOs like any whistleblower. So they can come to us, and they are not filing STR. They are just giving us information to say, this is the information that we have. And we'll work with that information the same way that we treat any information coming from any good person who wants to really report a crime. But we're not saying FIUs are a police station. You first call it's your police station. But if you feel this is financial crime and the FIU can play a role, you can go to your FIU. But where there is a challenge and FIU doesn't have an obligation to give feedback to you, and say this is what's happening in the case. FIUs can only inform law enforcement agencies and share intelligence products with law enforcement agencies. So if you want to really play a role and collaborate within your FIU, the best option will be to really speak to your FIU and say, this is what I'm doing. This is a critical subject based on what FATF has done. Even in the Egmont group, the group of FIUs, it's about 167 FIUs. We've done a research on this issue of illicit wildlife trade, illicit flows involved in illicit wildlife trade. So FIUs have a role to play. That paper was looking at the role of FIUs in this fight. So you can just approach an FIU and say, how do we work together? How do I share the information that I'm sitting with you? So we've got the collaboration with the NGOs, and NGOs are able to get information that we've sent it to law enforcement, and law enforcement is working on those cases.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we'll only have time for one more question. The gentleman on the left, on my left.
Thank you. I'm James Batman. I'm from UNL Ecuador, and I want to bring a weird case that happened in Ecuador. On Twitter, a person uploaded a video saying like, "Oh, I got my iguana from the Galapagos," and they open socks and they show how they got this iguana to Indonesia particularly, and the Ecuadorian National Police started an investigation, and part of the feedback that they got from Indonesia is like, these persons are using cryptocurrency. So can you let us know a little bit about that? It was like kind of shocking when we got that information because we weren't sure how to proceed investigating financial crimes using cryptocurrency.
Great question. Who would like to pick it up? I mean, are you seeing this this trend in using cryptocurrencies?
Well, I'll touch on it, and my answer probably won't be hugely satisfactory because for our bank, we have a very conservative stance on cryptocurrencies, so limited engagement. But I would hope that entities in that sector, they're under the same obligations as us in terms of having robust, anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terror mechanisms. And so, for a lot of these those organizations, they're relatively embryonic in the early stages. But the expectations, the U.S. government's been clear that the expectations are, apply to them equally. Yes, it's certainly a trend, a direction of travel, and it's an opportunity to bad actors, as we know, as we've talked about, will always try to explore and test and push boundaries, and try and identify gaps in controls. And I would hope that the crypto exchange or whatever party in that instance would, at the very least, learn from that experience and improve controls for future incidents.
Yeah, Ben, perhaps?
Just to say, we did some research earlier this year, and we did speak. We were talking about responses to around money laundering, around IWT, to a variety of different institutions, and I was actually really surprised that the cryptocurrency provider that I spoke to actually had one of they had one of the highest bars of assessment. They excluded the most business areas, and because of the blockchain system, they had potentially a greater visibility of transactions than some of the traditional banking partners would. So I would say engage. You never know. It came as a real genuine surprise to me how proactive they were. But there's millions of different types of cryptocurrency out there, and whether they're a responsive one or not, wouldn't know.
Thank you so much. This actually reminds me, we did originally plan to have the representative of Luna, one of the cryptocurrency companies, in here, but they were not able to make it. Nor did the traffics director, who was supposed to moderate this panel, Rick Scobie. Unfortunately, for health reasons, he was not able to come. So you had to put up with me, I'm afraid. But yeah, we still, I think, had a great panel this evening. So I'd like to thank all of them, really, and Rowena Watson as well, for yeah, for joining us and for discussing. I know how important and how challenging the cooperation with the finance industry might be, and what the best ways to engage it are actually available. And last but not least, thank you so much for staying with us until this late hour, and have a nice evening. Thank you so much.